Hi, good evening, everybody. As Neil mentioned, name's Mohammed Dalech. I would describe myself as a academic, mixture of both an academic researcher, but also a practitioner in the field. Thank you for joining this lecture today. And I want to share some insights from my personal experience, both of research and walking through the British countryside, and also a bit of experience internationally as well. Obviously, this walk's titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Uncovering Rural Britain's Racially Diverse History. And it focuses on the erasure and rediscovery of racially diverse histories in our rural landscapes across the UK. I have been walking for over 30 years and have been an advocate for access and engagement in our landscapes, particularly for racially diverse communities, both in terms of advocating, but also taking groups out and experiencing the outdoors in many different ways. I pursued my PhD 2 years ago, looking at race and rurality, and particularly some of the history and heritage of racially diverse people across rural Britain. And I'm based at the School of Museum Studies in Leicester. And I think looking at this, the rural idyll is something I started work on back in the mid-90s when a report came out called Keep Them in Birmingham by Eric J. And he talked about this rural idyll and no problem here. And from there, we often imagine that the countryside is a sort of a timeless white pastoral landscape. And the myth of the rural idyll masks are really a complex and diverse reality. And the idea that racially diverse people are newcomer to Britain feeds into this false narrative and false image. But the truth is, our histories are rooted in these landscapes, and our presence is not new. It's long-standing and significant, and that the importance of belonging and memory of these places are there for many people over a long period of time. And this is something that sort of I've been exploring both right since the early 90s, when I started working in the southwest of England, looking at some of the historical periods there, particularly related to slavery in that area, moving on to around different parts of the country, and looking at the rich diversity that's existed in those rural areas for a long time before then. So what I want to sort of talk about is some of my walks and the stories in the silence, some of my personal encounters, places with untold histories, and the mixed reactions as well that you get. And walking through rural Britain, yeah, you experience a whole range of things. Some of it I've come across, some of it I hadn't come across before, some of it I'd read about. And you come across this history and heritage, and you sort of look at it, but how visible this heritage and history is, or not visible, and how many people know about it or don't know about it. And also sometimes my visible presence as a minoritized person, as a racialized person in these spaces, also draws attention to this as well, both welcoming at times and also unwelcoming at times. And I think somebody to say that countryside is not necessarily neutral. And what follows over the next set of slides is some walks, some images, and some conversations that we've had over those walks. So this one, in 2023, a colleague and I, Jacqueline, who's actually just successfully defended her PhD, walked Hadrian's Wall. And we both walkers, long distance walkers, and we wanted to explore, particularly with Hadrian's Wall, the African history, and particularly as it was 1900 years of the wall, and celebrations were ongoing at that time. Um, and clearly there were Roman regiments along the wall, um, across the wall, right from Newcastle in Wallsend all the way to Brath by Sands. Um, and it was a multicultural hub. And they included soldiers from North Africa, and obviously one of the most important emperors, Septimius Severus, ruled from, as Neil mentioned, York, and his legacy is part of that British landscape. But what we found as we were walking, both Jackie and I, was how that story wasn't necessarily being relayed on the interpretation boards or in a whole range of places. It was even in guidebooks. So for us, it was that invisibility of that history that wasn't there. And just before we came on, I was sort of having a conversation around Carlisle Cricket Club, where they've found one of the largest Roman baths. Again, there's clearly evidence around Severus, but again, very little is talked about in the public domain. And for us, this was something that we were quite sort of interested by as to why this wasn't the case. And moving on, these are just some of the images, and what we found was there were, for example, in some of the museums, information boards that highlighted the rich history and diversity. And we were sort of looking around people in those museums and seeing if they were interested in that or not, or were they just running around. But also, there wasn't some outwardly open information. So, for example, the 1900 year exhibition in Carlisle, we looked at the brochures and things, and we couldn't see anything that said there is anything to do with the African history within the exhibition. So we sort of discussed it and thought, well, actually, is it worth going in to view the exhibition if you're not going to see what we want to actually see? So we gave it a miss because there wasn't actually being sold. And I think this is something that we've come across, is why the story and the history is not being told. And literally sort of 10 minutes from where I live, the plaque, the blue plaque that was unveiled by David Olusogun, around the first recorded African community settlement that guarded the Roman fort at Brath by Sands. So again, that history is there, and it's in some places been told, and some places it isn't. But how widely is it known, and how far are people, both visitors and tourists, and people who walk the wall, are aware of that history, or are they just walking the wall because it's a long distance walk? So it's something that we've been exploring for a while. And yes, we did generate quite a bit of interest from the walk. So as you can see, sort of one of the things we did as we walked along the wall was we actually tweeted and put posts up on Instagram, what is now X, Twitter, and Facebook, about our walk and our experiences, and also highlighting that missing history. And also we found that on information boards where, again, Severus was mentioned, but nothing else, or nothing about his origins or background. So again, it was something to think about. After I finished the walk, so we did get some interest from local TV, both Border and BBC News, to cover that story. But also Countryfile picked up in their episode on the 1900th anniversary of Hadrian's Wall. And yeah, we did some filming looking at that history and talking about that history and why it should be highlighted to wider audience, both from racially diverse communities, but the wider tourist community as well, within who come out and visit those areas. The other area I wanted to look at as well was as we walk through, wrong one. As we walk through Hadrian's Wall, and moving on to the south of the country, was looking at Dartmoor. And again, this I found when I was doing some literature review and searches around some of this history. And I knew the slavery history in Dartmoor from when I was working there. But what I didn't realize was the Dartmoor Prison was actually between 1813 and 1815. was one of the first, or the first, racially segregated prison in American history. Um, and that the prison was home to 7,500 American prisoners. But it and in that period, that the white prisoners of war, of which 1,000 were men of color, Native American, African Americans, and Africans. The white prisoners actually asked for segregation from the black prisoners, which led to this becoming the first racially segregated prison in America. And again, these are sort of stories. Now, again, some of the curators at the Dartmoor Prison Museum have picked this up and started putting some information together and information interpretation within the museum, because obviously the prison is still a working prison. But again, is sort of again telling some of these stories which seem to be hidden away. Now, some people have been telling these stories, and these are two resource packs. One in Devon that was published in 2003, looking at that Black history in Devon, and then the other one was in a teacher's resource back in Cumbria, again highlighting some of the Black history across Cumbria, particularly related to slavery. Again, giving that information out to teachers for education purposes, but also general knowledge as well, to allow people to understand exactly what the history of the area is. And hopefully schools and teachers would pick that up and address that within their communities and organizations. But still we find that it's very limited, because teachers sometimes I've come across quite fearful of addressing some of these issues and keep on safe grounds. But some of the resources are there. And I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian. My interest is sort of the landscapes and enjoying the landscapes and getting people to enjoy the landscapes, but also understanding that history that's been there in those landscapes from many, many decades and centuries ago, and how we tell those stories both to walkers. Because over the last sort of 10 years or so, there's been a huge increase in walkers from different communities going out into the outdoors. And it's about not just walking, but actually understanding the geology, the archaeology, the history of those areas, that people can understand more of those communities. And also people who live in those communities to understand that history of where they live and where they work. So moving on, the erasure of the rural and the rural heritage sector. And again, it's sort of museums and sites tend to focus on white histories. And that reinforces the idea that rural Britain is and always was white. And whether this is part of that sort of white spatial imagery, and what also then comes from that is, which includes people of color from rural sort of narratives, media, tourism, and education, and often overlook those histories and stories. This erasure is, I suppose, it's not accidental, but can be seen as systemic. I must say there are some initiatives starting to address some of these issues, although they tend to address them in things like Black History Month or South Asian History Month. And there needs to be a move away from focusing on that, and something that should be looked at sort of wide across the whole year, and not just sort of pigeonholed or pigeonholed into a month. All right, we'll do all the Black history in 1 month, rather than looking at it at different times of the year and building it in part of the whole exhibition. So that's something to sort of explore and look at as well. And that eraser, this is a poster that Bradford produced in the early 90s, after the disturbances they had about promoting Bradford. But what was interesting was how all around it they've placed all rural places around that picture. And yes, they've got a couple of mills in Bradford, but otherwise it's painting a picture of almost sort of saying, yeah, Bradford's in that rural space, and sort of avoid Bradford, but go up to these nice rural places. And it's how those sort of images are portrayed to the wider public. And this was something that appeared in a Cumbrian local paper a couple of years ago, in 2 years ago, where again sort of a ferry company was accused of whether they were censoring some of the Windermere links to slavery, where the company told the skippers not to talk about some of the history around the shores, around some of the lakeshore houses that were built from those who profited from slavery, which was interesting because not many of the, again, talking to the individual on the photograph there weren't many complaints from people, so it was interesting how and why the company decided not to talk about this. And again, is this sort of censoring and not talking about the history, and why that has been the case for that. And that can be seen in a lot of other places as well, from other examples. But this is something that's come about and was quite highlighted quite a bit around 2023 as to why that was done. I wanted to do a bit of a comparison with Yosemite. And as part of my Churchill Fellowship, which I was honored to receive in 2019, I actually visited America and Yosemite, and spent a whole week there talking to a number of people and rangers. And again, Yosemite seems as a quintessential sort of American wilderness and national park. But again, it has a huge, large, rich multicultural history from the late 1800s, where Chinese laborers were instrumental in building the infrastructure of Yosemite National Park, including a whole range of trails and roads that run through the park. Yet their stories, until sort of in the last 5 or 10 years, have been excluded from the official narratives for generations. And one person who's been working on that has been these histories and sharing this information is a ranger called Yen Chan, a national park ranger and historian for quite a number of years. And her research and public interpretation has brought some of this information to light, and also sort of getting people to sort of explore some of those areas and walks in Yosemite, and as part of the mainstream sort of information that's given out. And the other person that's pictured with me there, Ranger Shelton Johnson, I've been following him for the last 20 or 30 years. One of the first African American rangers, and he's been around for almost 30 years as a ranger, and most of those years have been in Yosemite. Has spent decades telling the story of Buffalo Soldiers, the Black U.S. Army Regiment, who served some of the first stewards of Yosemite and other national parks in the early 20th century. But again, until Shelton and a few others before him, we've started talking about these stories and telling these histories, that people have started to sort of realize that history and story that's actually there and has been there for many years, and how they continue, which one of the reasons they also do this for, and I think this is an important aspect for us in this country as well, is to attract more tourists from those communities, to understand and learn about those histories and enjoy those landscapes as well. Because it's part of their belonging as well, and part of their histories as well. And that's something that I think sometimes you say, what can we learn from each other? And I think that's something that we can learn from America, particularly some of the work that some of those rangers have been doing over the last few years. And again, sort of an anecdote that Shelton shared with me was how he managed to convince Oprah Winfrey to actually come camp a night in Yosemite. And you can imagine the PR and publicity that would have got, and the attraction that would have given people to actually come into Yosemite National Park, if you can get someone like her coming into thing. And their work, I think, reminds us that the care and and shaping of the most iconic and natural places have always involved people of color, even if they've been written out of some of the histories. They've been there, engaged, and again, he shared some images and talked about some images that when residents have been to Yosemite, that the Black Rangers were taken out of the photos. Moving on, reclaiming the narrative. And I think that's something that's important both for the heritage sector, is changes happening, and grassroots working groups are going out and reclaiming some of those spaces, and projects like Colonial Countryside that Professor Corinne Fowler has been involved with National Trust have highlighted some of this work and engaged young people in this work to tell those hidden histories. And some local museums are starting to engage diverse audiences and voices in history projects. I went out to Cornwall earlier this year to look at some of the history work that they've done in the museum. And again, sort of looking back at some of the, whether looking at tin mining or telecoms, how they attracted people from all over the world to come and learn about those industries in Cornwall. And they've put a whole range of information together. And it's how do you keep on telling those stories, both in terms of this digital or whether it's oral history projects. But inclusive programming are all part of that vital work and that community engagement. And again, Corinne Fowler's latest book around Our Island Stories and 10 colonial walks across Britain highlights some of those stories, and stories that people may not have heard about. So again, it's sort of sharing those different stories and walks that people have been engaged in. And there's quite a number of people within the communities who are actually engaged in telling those historical narratives to a wider audience. And it's also reimagining the rural. And I think this is something that's important, and something that sort of I started off with at the start, is rural Britain is and always has been diverse. And we must reimagine that rural Britain is not as a museum frozen in time, but as a dynamic space of shared histories. The countryside is for everyone. By recognizing our presence in the past, we can assert our belonging in the present and the future. And inclusive heritage practices are not optional, but they're necessary. And particularly in the protected landscapes and in the protection of our landscapes, to include as a diverse and a wide range of audience to engage with these landscapes in rural Britain, but also the histories and heritage in rural Britain, so they feel that belonging and connection with that history and work that's going on. So again, yeah, calling for inclusive heritage practices and that the countryside is for everyone. And I wanted to just sort of add this as part of the 1900th anniversary. Number of artists along the wall were commissioned to produce a range of images to put out as part of an exhibition on Hadrian's Wall. And Viga Brennan asked me when she read about my walk along Hadrian's Wall and the stories we were trying to tell. She asked me sort of to sit for a portrait, or stand for a portrait at the church in Bruff by Sands. And because it was named Abalava Port, and which meant apple orchards. So this is that picture in the door of the church. And finally, just a final thought, which I want to leave you with. Just to say that we're not new here. We've always been here, and that we are hidden in plain sight. And there's something that sort of comes across people. So yeah, there's some groups of people, for example, Syrians have just arrived in the last 5 years. Well, actually, there were Syrian archers here 1900 years ago, but people don't always think about that and talk about that within our histories. And for me, I'm lucky that I have the landscapes all around me and I can visit those places and understand some of that histories around me. Um, so yes, thank you very much for your time. I welcome any questions and reflections you may have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mohammed. That was really fascinating. I suppose to kick off, um, you've really experienced Hadrian's Wall. What was the most moving bit? Where do you have a bit where you feel a really close sense of connection with it, and why? I would ask.
I think the first bit of close connection was at Vindolanda because we weren't rushing toward the wall. We took our time over 6 days. And when we popped into Vindolanda and we saw, as one of the photos showed, we were at the place where Severus was supposed to have stayed. I think that's when it really hit us that there was that history there. So I think that probably would have been the bit that would have been the most important part or most emotional part of that journey. I'm talking to some of the archaeologists of Vindolanda as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Mohammed, I think it was definitely Neil, and
Okay.
we have lost him momentarily, so I shall jump on
Okay.
and take his place. But I think what Neil was trying to say just then was that we've had a request to ask if somebody can use your fabulous term, academic.
It's not my term. It's been used by a lot of people, so I think anybody can use it.
It's brilliant. I absolutely love it. I think I may well adopt it as well. Hopefully Neil will be able to rejoin us. We will see where we go. But in the meantime, shall I ask you a question? So we've got one here from David, and he's asking, are there any traces of the children fathered by the soldiers at Hadrian's Wall or from castaway sailors of the Spanish Armada?
I personally haven't come across anything as such. I know from the slave trade there has been descendants, and that can be traced back to family even now from early in the 1800s, particularly within Cumbria. So I know that exists, but I haven't come across any whether there's any children fathered by soldiers from Hadrian's Wall. I'm sorry about that.
Sorry, oh, I thought we had a glimmer of Neil there. I think he's on his way back in. I suppose that's one of the challenges we have with the archaeological record, though, isn't it? It can be really difficult for us to, because it is so piecemeal, to be specific about some of those things. Neil, are you back? Can you hear us? Can we hear
I
you?
I am back, and thank
Excellent.
you. Sorry, that's never happened before, so it's a bit that was a bit scary. Maybe I was just asking my question really badly, but anyway, Mohammed, thank you very much.
Okay.
And I've seen you've answered that next question. I was quite intrigued by that question because I think whilst DNA studies can be really helpful, I think we're also challenged by them because what we're now used to with joining sites like Ancestry is getting very quick answers about DNA, but it's much more complex than that. So again, I'm not sure we've really got the true data to actually say how local nations were impacted and changed over time. People were in
I'm losing you again, I think.
which I
Neil, you're breaking
think
up
is
again,
really
I'm
important.
afraid.
Okay, let's go. Let's go on to another. Can you won't work?
Oh, Neil, you still there? He's gone again. I shall move on to the next question. So we've had a question here from a different David. Fascinating to see how some of our landscapes were way more diverse in the past than they are today, or were 70 years ago. Is this something not to teach to our children from a very young age? Our history books are silent on this, and surely their reach goes further than visiting actual sites.
I totally agree, and it is something that we should have in our education system, and teachers and schools and education systems should be encouraged to teach that whole range of history that includes that diversity that existed not only 70 years ago, way beyond that as well. I think some teachers do it well, some schools don't, but it's very much dependent on the education system, the schools. But yes, definitely worth putting further work in there.
Do you think it's changing? Do you think there is a drive for change, or is it?
I think it varies on the schools and the teachers individually, because from my experience, if the teacher is really invested in it, then they will do that work and go above and beyond to make sure that's covered. But if they're not, then they'll do the basics and the minimum that they can do, rather than go into detail about some of the other issues. And that goes into a whole range of other subjects as well, not just this subject we're talking about.
Yeah, so more fundamental change within the curriculum that we need to move towards, and I guess that's not something that's going to happen quickly, is it? But something that we need to continue to push for. So if we go on to the next question, we've got one from Anne, and she's asking, what is the evidence for racial diversity for pre-Roman British societies and cultures? So I guess that's kind of a little bit aligned with the one we had earlier about Hadrian's Wall and the Spanish Armada, isn't it?
I think there is, and I said I'm not a historian, but there is lots of evidence there. And I think the CRE, what was the CRE, Commission for Racial Equality, did some work around the histories within UK around that. So there is evidence. It's a case of searching it and then putting it out into the public domain, or it's in the public domain, but it's how much people know about it. But there is evidence there.
Brilliant. And hopefully, you know, kind of as techniques improve and as we start to, I think one of the good things about archaeology and archaeologists is that we do continuously go back and look at what people have done previously, what conclusions they came to based on the evidence they had at the time, and obviously influenced by the world at the time. And I think we are good at going back and reflecting on that and changing those narratives. So hopefully, you know, kind of we can continue to do that and continue to move towards a much richer and better, you know, kind of more representative narrative in the future. So next up, we've got an interesting one from Jasper here, again, Hadrian's Wall one, and asking if there's any evidence for Black people being promoted to commanding positions on Hadrian's Wall.
Well, I think there would be evidence, and I think we had people like the Emperor. So there were people in those commanding positions within the Roman Empire. So I think that's evident there, is just sort of telling those stories again. Even sort of talking about Emperor Severus, how many people know about who Severus was? And I showed that image of interpretation board where it mentions his name, but not his origin, of where he and his wife were from. So I think it's about telling the origins of those individuals beyond that.
Absolutely. And hopefully, again, that's something that we can continue to kind of grow and enrich through time. So David's asked, would it be fair to say that the mixed body of Romans would have left just as they arrived, with the body of Romans as they withdrew from this island, from the UK? Or was it much more kind of complex and fluid than that? Did some of those Roman soldiers and Roman settlers that came, I mean, Roman settlers certainly, they came and they stayed, didn't they?
I'm sure, again, people who would have stayed and people who would have made their lives here. and there would have been a whole range of people come and go. So I think it would be quite a mixed sort of array of people coming and going in that period.
Yeah, I think you know, kind of, I think in many ways the way in which the people were moving at that time is it's the same as we do now. You know, we move to a new place.
Yeah,
You know, we make friends. You know, we build relationships. We create families. You know, businesses. Everything else that means that we have ties with that place and connections. And you know, I can't imagine that people would have felt any differently in the past when they were moving around and moving to different countries. So I can imagine some of those Roman settlers will have come over and found deep connections with their with wherever it was they were posted or came to. So um, we've got moving away from Hadrian's Wall and down into Wiltshire. Um, Bill asks, he says, I think you said you found links at Avebury early in your career. Can you please expand on this?
I didn't mention Avebury at all or Wiltshire. I'm not sure. Might be my accent or something, but I do have a slight West Country twang in my accent, but I can't recollect anything in Avebury.
Wow. We will, that's a new place to go and investigate for us
It
all
definitely is.
and find out about. Absolutely.
Definitely.
Brilliant. Okay. So, next up, what methods of providing interpretation in the landscape would you suggest for rural, remote areas?
I think obviously there are interpretation boards, and when I talk about interpretation, I sort of also talk about it to make sure that the wider public knows and tourists knows about that interpretation history. And I would suggest sort of highlighting some of that information on there where it's relevant. But also, I think a lot of people now rely on digital media as well, and how you put that interpretation onto digital platforms so people can sort of know about some of those histories and interpretation of where they're visiting before they even get there, so they can actually sort of explore things even further and do their research before they actually get to some of those locations. So I think it's about making it as widely accessible as possible. And also now, I also argue that you don't necessarily need to look at translations, because you've got Google Translate and other translation platforms which will translate text for you. But it's making that history and what's known about some of those areas accessible, and even maybe theming some walks around some of those areas as well. So one of the things a group I'm involved with in September doing a hidden histories walk along a small part of Hadrian's Wall, just to sort of as a public social walk as part of the YHA's Walking Festival. So again, it's sort of exploring different ways of getting that information out by using some of those community groups that are already out there to tell those stories as well as using archaeologists and other curators who can tell those stories as well, but using a whole range of mediums to tell those stories and interpreting them so people know about them.
Brilliant. And Clemency, literally, I think just as we started to ask that question was putting in her own here, which is, are you starting to see improvements in the interpretation of our diverse past along walking routes and at heritage sites and in protected landscapes? If not, what steps do you advise land managers to take to research and share more of these stories? And I wonder whether there's something there about that. You talked about before about kind of dropping in and just doing something once, or kind of Black History Month, where we have this little period, this little window of time where we do something and then it goes away again. How do we do something that's more consistent and more ongoing?
I think there's a number of steps here. I think some properties and landscape bodies are starting to tell those stories and putting interpretation on. And I think one example of that is people like the National Trust who've started doing that. There are a number of other projects around the country that have started doing that as well. I think the Royal Museum have done some work around that. So I think there's loads of things there. I think it's clearly researching what's around, looking at the gaps and identifying those gaps and putting that information out there so people can actually view it. And I think what sometimes stops people is fear. We're in a period of time where there's always this sort of bit of a backlash. But when we talked about our walk along Hadrian's Wall in 2022, yes, we had a bit of a backlash as well. Every time we put something up, there'll be somebody on Twitter or Instagram who would say, "Well, that's not true," including after we had the feature in Country File. But I think if you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing, then you should be able to sort of defend that off and put that information out there. Same with landscapes, telling people where some of those histories are, and particularly tourist brochures and those sort of places are really important because that's where tourists go to see where they can. The first thing they do when they look around is, what can I do around Windermere, or what can I do around Mam Tor, or what can I do around Castleton, or some of the big towns, or what can I do around Settle or Skipton. So it's actually highlighting some of those histories in your websites, in your sort of apps and stuff, so people can see what they can and cannot do. And I think that's really important, because that then tells people, all right, they recognize that history, and also encourage people to explore it a bit further, and then that also benefits a whole range of other organizations, people like BCA, in terms of understanding and reaching out to new audiences, because that interest will engage people into looking, all right, I want to get involved in some archaeological digs because it's related to some parts of my history and my past and my ancestry. So I think there's lots of ways. And I think sometimes it's also worth engaging, just to say, with some of those communities as well, to have those conversations with communities on how you interpret that information and what goes on and how it goes on and how to reach those audiences. I know for a lot of some of the work I do, yes, I can use socials, but also using WhatsApp and other messenger services gets to a far wider audience, because that's where they're communicating through those areas.
And I suppose there's an element of trust in there as well. I think that kind of, building those relationships with communities and kind of working with them to think about how they want those stories to be told. But I suppose, it's not something that's a quick win, is it? You have to build those relationships and connections, and over time, that will then lead to a much deeper and a much richer conversation. Brilliant. So we've still got questions coming in, which is great. There's an excellent one here, which is, how might studying life around Hadrian's Wall challenge our modern assumptions about borders, identity, multiculturalism in the ancient societies?
I saw that question come in and I thought, and I think it just highlights how diverse and particularly and this conversation's been had. I know the MP in Newcastle has raised this as well, because the National Trail, Hadrian's Wall Trail, goes along the Tyne and doesn't follow the line of the wall along the West End. And if you sort of think about it, the West End now is a really diverse part of Newcastle, as it was 1900 years ago. But whoever drew the National Trail and decided to take it along the Tyne, and that would have been my worst part of the walk, actually, walking along the Tyne. I thought, why are we walking along the Tyne for? Why can't we follow the path or the line of the wall? Well, I think there's a lot of story to tell between what was there and what's happening now, but also in terms of the wider educational perspective around whether you want to call it multiculturalism or the diverse communities that live in this country, and how borders are always changing and shifting. They're never statutory, and with everything that's going on in the globe, whether it's climate change, the environmental crisis, global wars, those borders are becoming very blurred. And people have always, right from then to now, have always moved around. And I think it's a lesson that we can learn and pass on to our younger people. It's linked back to that one of the very first questions around education, of how we can use education to get children at a very young age around what diversity has existed in this country for centuries.
And I guess as how we can use places and landscapes that we're familiar with to enable us to have some of those challenging conversations about things that are happening in the world around us, and how we can kind of better relate to some of those things that might feel more removed from us, actually kind of finding that common ground and that sense of connection with people across the globe, I think, is really important, isn't it? And speaking of traveling and tourists, we've had a question here from you. Apologies if I've pronounced your name wrong there. What are the problems with tourists not becoming involved in history from abroad? So I think people traveling and visiting and not connecting with the stories of those places.
What's the problem with tourists not becoming involved? I think sometimes they're not aware of that histories. So I think that there's an element of, if I'm reading the question right, if people are not aware of the histories, there is less chance of connecting. I remember going to talk to a group that come from Sheffield at the Sill 2 or 3 years ago, and they arrived late on the Friday. They didn't get there till 10, 11 o'clock. But I was still sat there at 1:30 in the morning talking about some of the histories on Hadrian's Wall, because they were really interested and asked to continue that conversation. And yeah, they just traveled from Sheffield up to sort of Northumberland, but they were really, really interested and engaged in that whole conversation that was going on. And I think there's an element of how do you bring that conversation into those tourists and visitors, where it's shown. And if it's not there in the information centre, if it's not there in where they'll look, then they can't connect with those histories. It's like, yes, there are gravestones and plaques and stuff, but unless they know where they are and what it's telling them, people won't make the effort to actually engage with that. But as soon as you tell them and tell the tourists that those histories are there, they will make an effort to go and visit those places and make an effort to see those places, rather than thinking, oh, well, there's nothing there. So I think that it is an important part of the storytelling to tell those stories in different ways that people know about them. And I think the tourism sector has a responsibility as well.
It's about making those stories more visible in the first place, and then people will naturally be more engaged with them, won't they? And want to know more and be interested. And there's a question here from Steve, which is the resistance to changing history from some sectors an issue to improving our understanding the diversity of our society in the past?
Yes, I think there is. And I think what sets in is there's a bit of fear sets in into those organizations to think, well, we can't tell this story because we will get a backlash of some sort. So I think there is that fear of organization thinking, no, we don't want to do that because that will attract attention, rather than sort of standing up to the history that is there, and not sort of thinking, I don't want to tell it because we might get us into challenge. So I think it is a really, really interesting question. And I think that resistance is a bit of a cause of not that story not being told, and sometimes limited to things like Black History Month or South Asia. Oh yeah, we'll do our bit at Black History Month, rather than becoming something of a regular business as usual part of the organisation.
Yeah, I think we have to keep working towards being consistent and it becoming just a natural part of what we do, don't we? It shouldn't be something that is different or special for a specific point in time. And I think you're absolutely right about that. That's element of fear within that. And I think, you know, it needs people to just be brave and to be prepared to be open and to listen and to not be afraid to make mistakes along the way as well. You know, it's better to try and learn as you go, I think, than to not do anything at all just in case. So where are we? Where's my next question?
Andrew's question fits in with that one actually.
Yeah.
And I think.
Oh yes.
I think.
Shall I read it out? Is this so this is there any reason why the National Trust have etc. have not highlighted the diversity of the past? Have they been challenged on this, and what was their response?
The National Trusts are probably one of the organisations who've done quite a lot of work on this, particularly since the report came out on their properties in 2020 or 2021. They have looked at their properties and some of the displays and so on, and have actually sort of changed the interpretation and so on. So they're one of the sort of people, and I think English Heritage have done some work as well, but National Trusts have definitely done work, particularly since the report came out. And they also got a lot of challenge from the report as well as the report was published, including the authors of the report, because all they was doing just putting out the history out there to what those properties histories were. So I think that's a National Trust has taken that on board, and they've been doing a lot of work since then to address that, and have made changes in the way they interpret some of the items and properties that they have in their portfolio.
Yeah, I think there's a definite kind of desire to change there, isn't there? And I know from the work that we've done with some of the National Trust properties that they are very much trying to find the right way to best reinterpret and to share the stories of their properties in a more, I was going to say realistic way. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but you know, a more rounded way that isn't just kind of about the things. It's about how those things came to be there, and the people, the story of the people that were involved in this.
Yeah.
So, we've had a question from Jasper, and they're asking. Could part of the problem be, and I think this touches on what you were talking about earlier, Mohammed, could part of the problem be that unless you know the wider background in terms of events that lead to the history of an area, then people might not necessarily know what you're talking about, and they use going to somewhere like America or Australia, and you know, hearing a talk about a battle or a conflict that took place, and not knowing that kind of wider context for those stories. Could that is that part of the challenge, and does that go back to that kind of earlier conversation about education and just that wider ability to tap into those histories and those stories?
Yeah, and people coming from other places, other countries may not know this history, but also, particularly if they come into certain areas, you'd expect, if they come into Hadrian's Wall, you'd expect somebody to do some research around Hadrian's Wall. But again, it's what they read will tell you different things, will tell you different stories and different histories. So there is an element, but for example, I knew before I went to Yosemite what I was looking for and why I wanted to go there, because of the histories more than anything else. Because I knew the histories were there and I wanted to see what they were doing and how they were telling those stories. But again, sometimes it felt like there were individuals telling those stories rather than the whole organization, although I think the whole organization's behind it as well, because they've done it in a lot of other places. But there is an element of, you wouldn't necessarily know the history of another part of the world if that's not what's taught in your school. So there is that element of what you know and what you don't know, and how much people know and how much they don't know.
Yeah, and I suppose part of it is kind of as somebody visiting a place, there's there's an opportunity there for us
Yeah.
to create change by saying, tell me more, and asking the questions and saying why and how and who, and if the people at that place that kind of the guides or at the museum, whoever it is, if they're not able to answer your question, then that's one thing. That's fine. People, may need to go away and learn and do their own research. But if they're not asked the questions, what's prompting them to go and do that? So I think it's really important that we take those opportunities if we want to know more about a place and understand the people that were there, to feel empowered to go and ask those questions if that information isn't presented to us. So we're just at 8 o'clock. We're just about out of time. I've got one last question for you, Mohammed, from Beth, which was, in addition to David Olasuga and Corinne Fowler's work, do you have any reading recommendations?
One of the very first books I read was Peter Fryer, Staying Power, and that covers a lot of history as well. So I'd recommend that one.
Yeah, brilliant. And just finally, last question. How do people find out more about your work? Because I know you are doing lots and lots of research at the moment. I know you've got some walks that are going to be coming up. How do people find out more about what you're up to?
So I think I put a slide up at the end with my email address and my social. My social is MIDHAL. So if you follow me on my socials, then that will get you, and I'll put it in the chat. And that will get you to me.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Listen, Mohammed, thank you so much. I know Neil is in the audience now watching us, and he very much would like to say thank you along with me for coming and speaking for us tonight. It's been absolutely brilliant. We've really enjoyed hearing from you, and we shall look forward very much to seeing where your research goes and what comes next for you. And thank you to everybody who's been here with us tonight. Apologies for that minor technical hitch and for me having to jump online and step in for Neil. Just before you all leave us, I've got a quick link that I'm going to pop in the chat for a little feedback survey. We will email this out to you as well. But if you have a moment, please do let us know what you thought, and that would be really helpful for us. Also, if you enjoyed tonight's event, we have some more activity coming up and a whole load of online material that you can access as part of our Out and About event that finishes this Sunday. There's a link in the chat so you can go and find out more about that. And the very last thing I want to say is that our next This is Archaeology lecture will be part of the Festival of Archaeology. So it will be in July. I haven't got the date because I wasn't expecting to be here telling you this, but it will be in July, and it will be Dr. James Dilley, Nadia Norman and Aidan Phillips, and they will be talking about prehistoric archaeology and how they brought it to life at Stannick Lakes. So again, there's a link in the chat, and go and have a look and find out more about that. And hopefully we will see you there. But that's it for this evening. Thank you again, Mohammed. Really appreciate your time. Brilliant talk. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us this evening. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.